Great. First of all, I want to say welcome and thank you for making time to come to this workshop. I'm really excited to talk to you all. My name is Andrea Scott, and I'm professor of academic writing and director of college writing at Pitzer College. I'm currently on leave for the year, and I'm spending some time as a research associate for a center for teaching and learning in Germany. It's quite late, my time. We might be interrupted by a toddler sometime at some moment during the presentation, so I ask for your patience during the presentation, but I'm really excited to talk to you, particularly because Germany has been a region of the world that has been thinking a lot about teaching writing in the age of ChatGPT. There's a lot of federal funding around these initiatives, and it's been interesting for me to think about these questions, but also think about them transnationally as different communities are entering this new age where ChatGPT and generative AI is suddenly on our radars and suddenly something that our students are using and that we're figuring out what we think about and figuring out whether or if to what extent we want to use it ourselves. And so my goal with today's presentation, I can say I'm not an expert in ChatGPT. I don't teach courses on writing in the age of ChatGPT. Maybe eventually at some point I will. But I have been looking carefully at some of the research that's emerging and thinking about what are some best practices or some questions that it makes sense to think about together. So before we get started, I want to ask you to register for ChatGPT if you have not already. And Sarah will go ahead and send you a link to that so that you can make sure you have a browser open in your computer. Since we're going to dive in, and instead of me talking quite a lot at the beginning about ChatGPT and what it can do, we're going to start by testing it out. And so you'll need to have access to that program at your fingertips. So without further ado, I'm going to start by just saying, this is something that you're probably all aware of. Can you all see my next slide? Did it work? My screen sharing? Yes. Okay, great. That faculty right now, we're kind of at a transitional moment, are all over the map in terms of how they're thinking about ChatGPT. This seemed evident in some of your interests that you expressed in today's workshop. A small number so far, according to a survey conducted in June 2023, are saying that faculty are saying, no way, you can't use ChatGPT in my course. Any use of it is an instance of cheating. It's absolutely forbidden to use it. A larger number than that are saying that they want to embrace ChatGPT in their teaching. They're saying this is going to revolutionize the way that we teach writing, and it's really exciting, or it's really important to teach, and I'm going to incorporate it absolutely in my teaching in the near future or right away. But the overwhelming majority are uncertain, right? They're willing to entertain the idea of incorporating ChatGPT into their own teaching, but really only if students understand the technology and also with some hesitation, right? So you can kind of think about where you are on that spectrum today. Are you in the no way camp? Possibly not, otherwise you might not be here today. Have you already embraced ChatGPT in your teaching, or are you still kind of uncertain or figuring out for yourself what it is you think it's most important to teach students about the technology? And before, so to tell you a little bit, so today's workshop is really kind of at folks maybe in that last camp who are a little bit uncertain and kind of thinking about what are some things to be aware of, what they might incorporate. So my plan for today is to dive into the deep end and start by having us talk a little bit about writing in our teaching, and then dive into using some of the technology and reflecting on it. Then a short definition of what is ChatGPT. I think we've all heard of this, but for many of us, it's new and it's worth repeating. What are some, and then I want to shift to what is my field, the field of writing studies, also literary studies. What's the current thinking about the risks and benefits to students and teachers in the context of writing, since that's the focus of today's workshop and talk. And what are some principles and recommendations that seem kind of like no-brainers? There's a lot of consensus in the field right now. And then hoping to leave us with an opportunity to go into breakout rooms and to think about maybe one small thing that you can do this semester to incorporate ChatGPT or be thoughtful in your instructions to students about why not to use ChatGPT in your course. So I'm hoping everybody will leave with some ideas that they can put into practice right away. And I will start with the disclaimer that the literature and the research out there is overwhelming, especially to those of us who are new to ChatGPT. So I'm a big fan of the small teaching concept, which is really to start small and to maybe listen in the context of this presentation for one or two or three things that strike you as interesting or relevant to your own practice. So since we're a smaller group today, there's only 17 of us. I might scrap this. I think I'm going to scrap this idea of the poll and just have you use the chat to take just a minute. And I'm a writing teacher, so I like to use writing as a vehicle for thinking, to just write down a sentence or two, and it doesn't have to be fully formed. It doesn't have to be a great idea. Just why do you assign writing in classrooms, right? We all come from different fields. We all teach different levels of courses. Like when you assign writing, like why do you do it? Why do you assign writing in your classes? So Stephanie says she wants to assess learning. And Esther says, because I want my students to learn that writing helps us think and organize our ideas. Barbara says she wants to connect students to each other and to ideas, to a body of knowledge. Sarah's saying it's a chance for students to think and express themselves individually and privately, maybe to gather their thoughts before they share in a large group. Cheryl says to practice communication and critical thinking. Sadie says students can communicate their science, learn the conventions of writing and chemistry, and understand how to think like a chemist. Claudia says it's an opportunity for students to become active learners, to think for themselves. Jason says for self-reflection and to communicate technical information. And Surya Tapas says, Surya says clarity of thought and perspective, and to practice communication. Writing is a vehicle for thinking in more vigorous, complex ways. And Sagyan says express their idea creatively, right? So there's this real sense that writing does a lot, right? That it's not just this, we don't just kind of write up our ideas at the end. What I'm hearing as like a thread throughout this, to have a record of the work. Yeah, it's a way of preserving knowledge, right? Preserving memory, that writing is a social activity, right? That it's embedded in disciplinary and professional practices. We want our students to learn how to think like chemists, or to engage professionally and authentically in the work of our fields, but we also want them to have a chance to think creatively and to express themselves, and possibly also use writing as a way of coming to terms with their own thinking. And Barbara mentions building community, right? That it's a chance to develop their ideas in relation to others, to build community by listening responsibly to what others have said, by listening responsibly to each other, and through sharing and engaging their own writing and ideas in the course. So we see that it's actually quite a complex social activity, and there's of course a lot of research on this. I want to highlight in my talk today this joint statement that came out by the MLA and the 4Cs, their joint task force on writing with AI, since this is the disciplinary body that has studied the practice of writing as a social activity. And there's just a wide consensus in the literature, 40, 50 years of research that shows that writing facilitates, as you said in the chat, right, the analysis and the synthesis of information. It helps us retain knowledge. It aids us in our cognitive development. And as Barbara said, it helps with social connections. Like we know that the writing classroom is a relationship-rich classroom often, right? Students are encountering and sharing and developing their ideas in community with each other. And that writing also participates in knowledge-making practices that allow students to actively insert themselves in public discourse, right? To participate in public life in diverse ways. And we know that writing is a process, as you've mentioned too, and not just a product. And it takes this, that it doesn't just sort of isn't just produced overnight or as a last step, that it's iterative, and that it's a generative process. And there's a lot of research also on how writing is, of course, a technology, right? And that we've always used assisted technologies to aid in our writing. I know one of the challenges of I use the design function of my PowerPoint to make my slides look prettier, right? That these are all kind of these assisted technologies that we use in our own work to help us focus on the things that are important to us. One of the things that I hate about PowerPoint is that I haven't figured out how to integrate it with EndNote, right? So I have to manually type out my citation, right? So, I mean, there are ways that we use technologies all the time to aid our writing, and ChatGPT is possibly just another technology that poses new opportunities, but also has some new risks associated with it. And so what I want us to do now is kind of take 10 minutes to do some self-study here. And what I want you to do is log into ChatGPT, and I want you to enter some prompts into the chat box. And you're going to take a moment, and this is an iterative assignment, and to read what ChatGPT generates, and just think about it for yourself. So I'd like you to start. Your first step is to enter this prompt that I gave you, right? Why do you assign writing in your classroom, like word for word, and see what ChatGPT comes up with. And then the second round, I want you to enter how would a writing studies scholar respond to this response? So people from my field, which is what I'm representing here, right, in my conversation with all of you. And then and then insert your own discipline, like an anthropologist or a biologist or a sociologist, respond to this response. And then for the fourth one, I want you to enter a key thinker or somebody that you admire, or just whatever comes to mind. How would blank respond to this response? And so you're going to enter a prompt, read what ChatGPT generates, enter a new one, and keep going until you get down to 4. And we'll take about 10 minutes to do this. And we'll come back and discuss what we found. So how are folks doing? Do you feel like you need another few minutes, or are you good to go? Good. Can I get a nod? Good to go? Or is it a no? I need a few minutes. Okay, good to go. All right. Awesome. So now that you've had a chance to just play around with a rudimentary feature of ChatGPT, I'm curious to know just what the exercise brought up for you. What kind of went through your mind as you were entering these prompts? Perhaps you played around with prompts of your own devising. Just what are some thoughts or some questions or impressions that you had? Just go ahead and unmute yourself and chime right in. We'll gather some responses here on the slide. What were some things that went through your mind during this exercise?
Super impressive.
Super impressive. Can you say more about that? What was impressive?
Well, on question 3, I asked it how it would think as a cultural anthropologist, and it brought up a number of great points, such as writing as a ritual, power dynamics in writing, cultural variability in writing practices. For prompt 4, I asked it, how would a post-work theorist respond to this response? And it dove right in and talked about rethinking the idea of productivity, thinking about writing as liberation, criticizing skill development for, the workplace. It was great.
Yeah. Okay. I had sort of a similar situation where, I asked it what it would do as a psychologist, and it references like self-efficacy or some like major theories in psychology, and that are correct. And I asked it to respond as bell hooks, and I feel like it has the content, but the aesthetics are wrong. Like and I know I could prompt it to write it as bell hooks, and perhaps it would sound like her, but it's not. The content's there, but the vibe is wrong.
Okay, so it could do the theory, but it couldn't do the tone, and maybe with some more prompting, it could do so. I think Stephanie, your hand has been up for a while, and then we'll go to Esther, Barbara, and Corey.
Thank you. I was really shocked because the last prompt I typed in I would like to say my academic crush. I just enjoy his work and I love everything that he writes about. And so it's Vershawn Ashanti Young, who really, really promotes like linguistic diversity and multilingual writing. And so it was saying that listed off like so many things that I totally value. Like it said, Vershawn Ashanti's Young response would likely center on issues of linguistic diversity, cultural inclusivity, and social justice, with a strong emphasis on challenging traditional language norms and advocating for more inclusive and empowering writing pedagogies. So even though it was like a really great summary that was concise, yes, it's missing a little bit more details about what it looks like or what that means. It's still very clear as to what those values are shaping.
Great. I think it was Esther, Barbara, and then Corey.
Hi. This is the first time that I actually used the program, so I'm really shocked. I had heard a lot about it. I've been in other workshops about it. I also asked about bell hooks, and I got the same reaction like Sarah, but now I also asked about how a sociologist would respond, because sociology is my training, and how a gender and feminist scholar would respond. And the responses are right on. But now I also asked about how Paulo Freire would respond. The responses are also right on. So when the software has people who are very well known and perspectives that are very well known, it responds very well. In a very detached, very, I don't know if mechanic is the way to put it, but it's very efficient and very thorough. But now I just asked about one of my mentors. Her name was Magali Pineda. She died a few years ago. She was one of the most important feminist activists in Latin America. And the response was very interesting because ChatGPT doesn't know her. But I'm assuming because of her name, the response was, well, this hypothetical decolonial scholar would say blah, 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 right? So I think that's also very interesting. And I know that this is one of the critiques that the platform has received, that it can reinforce the biases and the gaps that we have in knowledge already. So that's very interesting.
Right. So a lot there. Yeah, exactly. So it may be perpetuating who's at the center of a scholarly conversation versus who's at the margins, and maybe very U.S. centric in its knowledge of scholarship, like at the moment, right, in ways that are problematic. Barbara?
Yeah, this was really interesting. I think I'm gonna use it for my class, actually. Thank you. I put in 3 different people. So I'm in organizational studies. So I put in Frederick Taylor, who is responsible for Taylorism and in the industrial version of, like, you know, of organizational life. And then I did a critical race theorist, sociologist who writes on organizations. And I thought it was really interesting that the responses, some of them were similar, but of course they're very different. So one is about the Taylorism response was about like memorization and standardization, and the critical race theorist approach was more about breaking down paradigms and having students challenge established organizational ways of being. So I thought that was really interesting. It's interesting that it's all like a list of things, which I don't like that kind of writing. So I tell my students, please don't make a list of things. Like, that's not interesting to me. But the generic question was like, why do you assign writing? Where was it? Number 8 was promotion of creativity. Creative writing assignments such as poetry or fiction encourage students to explore their imagination. And this is a way to just emphasize that this is not allowing people to do that. So I could come up with this list of things. I could be like, oh, I need to write a teaching statement. Let me use ChatGPT, and here are my 3 top things. But I didn't, I feel like I would have robbed myself of the opportunity to really think, like, why do I do this? Why is this important? And who do I want to, how do I open up a conversation? Right. So I felt like this is not opening up a conversation. It's just like statements. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
So in a way, I'm hearing you say it's kind of a closed form. It's valuing, and that, you know, we all know, like, especially those of us who are, you know, literary or cultural scholars or sociologists, we know that style is not neutral, right? That there's this style of listing, this closed kind of form, or this value of efficiency is also making a kind of argument that might be out of alignment with our own values as scholars, or other kinds of values that we might have for our others' writings. Okay, Corey.
Yeah, thank you. So I use ChatGPT quite a lot for my course, my Pitzer first year writing course. And I actually have, as part of my, what's it called, custom instructions, set up to be the description of my course. So for custom instructions, whenever you start a new chat, it already starts it with that context in the background. So it tailored all of my responses directly to my course and my specific course's learning objectives and goals. So it was just very contextualized to my experience. And so I learned a lot about my course, and that I'm doing a lot of things well, but not to the pinnacle of recommendations that ChatGPT has for any of the 3 perspectives I gave it. But I think overall I'm broadly hitting across all of the 3 perspectives in a pretty good place. So it's, you know, ChatGPT works much better the more context you give it, and giving it your own course context could really tell you a lot about your experience.
Yeah, so that's really interesting too. So how can it be used to generate a response? It's too, maybe ChatGPT can also give us a bird's eye view, but also really disciplinary drill down into our own assignments in some way that's strangely revealing, even if it feels in some cases not quite right, right? And yeah, so I was kind of interested too in how maybe versions of these prompts that I gave you are things that we simulate in our class discussions, right? When we want students to engage in debate, sometimes we do that. We say, okay, let's approach this through the lens of X, Y, or Z. Um, um, but um, but yeah, so this is maybe another tool for getting out for approaching ways of discussing or entry points into scholarly conversations and how they can be different and all the questions and problems and possibilities that that opens up for us as scholars and learners. And I was also kind of interested too, as somebody who teaches writing at a small liberal arts college where we all are experts of teaching writing in our fields, right, to a sense, to think about the extent to which these kinds of tools can also make us think about how we integrate our own metaphors for teaching writing into the contents of our courses, right, or into our disciplines, right? So what kind of language would the field of anthropology or sociology give you for thinking about argument that is unique, right? Does it give you a particular way into thinking about the teaching of writing that feels like exciting and rich to you? And I mentioned this as a possibility for those who teach in first-year seminar programs or their close equivalents on the different campuses where the task is to teach first-year students how to write. But I think one thing that this tool could do for me, or a question that opened up for me, was to what extent could I sort of use this activity to help me think a little bit critically about the vocabulary or the approaches that I'm using to even think about something like the teaching of writing. So I'm going to toggle back to my PowerPoint again. So I'm going to go into some definitional work right now. Just what is ChatGPT? I think we all have read about this in the news a lot, but just by way of refresher, it's this idea of a computer system that can produce or generate various forms of traditional human expression, which might be in language, in images, through video, music, and large language models, which we've just experimented with one just now, ChatGPT, are a subset of generative AI, and they can deliver text-based formats, things like prose or poetry, or even programming code. And what does GPT mean? It just stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer, in case you were wondering, and hopefully our colleagues from Harvey Mudd could tell us more about that if we're inclined to investigate. But I think what's interesting for us is to think about these large language models as working by using statistics and probability to predict what the next character, right, the letter, the punctuation mark, even a blank space, is likely to be in an ongoing sequence. And in the process, that means spelling words, creating phrases, entire paragraph sentences, and paragraphs. So when I'm teaching this to students, I say it's like autocorrect, like on their phone, text messaging, right? And it gives you those possibilities for your text or for your email, but on steroids, right? And that it's just much more powerful. These large language models sort of interacting with Google in ways that have really upped its capacity. And I'm sure you're all aware of these general debates. These are the real general ones about the risks, the rewards of AI, the risks being that it perpetuates biases, as we've already said, can perpetuate inequities, right? And who gets cited, sort of citational inequities. Scholars like Sarah Ahmed have talked a lot about, like, could be perpetuating that, but also students might have unequal access to this material, students and scholars, based on resources, based on language, country, and so on. It produces inaccuracies. I think you've all heard about ways in which these systems can hallucinate. They don't cite sources, right? So you're not sure about the accuracy of the research. There are all kinds of questions around intellectual property and authorship that are raised since it's still a black hole and we don't quite understand where the texts are coming from. The private corporation, their algorithms and their methods, and then all kinds of ethical questions too about the environmental impact, also about ethics of research and transparency around our labor questions and what kinds of jobs AI might be making superfluous in the coming years. And the rewards, I mean, I bristle at these kind of neoliberal terms like efficiency and productivity. So, but there is a sort of a sense or dialogue out there about efficiencies, right? That maybe AI can take on some of the more laborious kind of smaller order thinking involved in writing and more efficiently produce reports. I would love it if it could do annual reports for me, right? Because they're so boilerplate, right? For the writing center, for example. But yeah, so might produce efficiencies. It can stimulate thinking, be used for brainstorming. We kind of practice doing that just now. It can be used for editing, right? So, you know, if somebody is sort of uncertain, I know somebody who's working in a multilingual context, like I rely on the software a lot to make sure that my work is polished, right? To save face, to edit things, to correct grammar, and so on, which can be useful for students with disabilities, for multilingual students, and also just for all of us to have some software that captures our so-called errors. And then there's lots of discussions about reimagining learning and assignment. So these are really general claims, right, that I think are just out there in the news. And so I don't want to dwell on them. What I'm really interested in is thinking, what about writing, right? So what do scholars of writing have to say about these issues? Let's see. So risks to students, right, is I think that students might miss opportunities to practice reading, writing, and thinking on their own, right? Because they're submitting these generative AI outputs or they're depending on AI to produce summaries for them for text rather than reading and engaging with the work themselves. I think there's a real risk that students, or what my field is saying, right? There's a real risk that students might not see writing or language study as valuable since machines can just produce language or produce text for us. So what's the value? What's the point? Students might experience this increased sense of alienation and mistrust if we're using surveillance and detective approaches to ensure that students are adhering to academic integrity, right? If we're using different kinds of plagiarism detection softwares, what does that do for the dynamic in the class? Do students feel surveilled or like that folks are directing mistrust towards them? Students can also face increased linguistic injustice because these LLMs are promoting sort of this uncritical normative reproduction of so-called standardized English usage, right? There's a particular style that seems that it's reproducing my language that's more homogenous, not dominant racial and economic power structures, and can contribute to the perpetuation of the dominance of English, right, in scholarship globally, right? So there's all kinds of linguistic justice connected. Talked a little bit about unequal access, right? Students might have unequal access to some of these elite tools, and which can also, or more some of these sophisticated tools, which can justices. And there are also risks to teachers that I'm just putting out there as we think about our own local context, right? There's a whole broader higher ed context out there that, you know, they're asked to make changes to their teaching practices without time, training, compensation for their labor, right? There might be an assumption that ChatGPT can do a lot for it, or certain teachers might not be getting support now, but kind of be tasked with responding. Or yeah, just kind of teaching it, but without a lot of support. And it takes a lot of time and energy, as I'm sure you're aware of, to develop a critical AI literacy. And if you're not well supported, right, that can divert attention away from teaching the content of your course or developing other aspects of your course in the learning environment that are exciting. And then there are also risks to programs and also to our professions, right? One is this notion that the public view of writing or its study, language study, might be seen as less valuable, right? Again, because machines can do this. And there may be an erroneous belief that these machines can replace things like, you know, critical thinking and reflection, the writing process, like process knowledge, like what it takes to actually produce a piece of scholarship or creative work, right? And also all of the metacognition that actually helps students learn. That's part of the writing process, their own reflection. And so institutions might really struggle, right, to plan and provide the kind of labor and resources needed to meaningfully respond to these challenges. And also these academic values around giving credit to sources may be compromised because LLMs, a lot of them don't actually cite sources. They probably will in the future. The Microsoft version can cite sources. And then this uneven access to AI text generators might promote inequalities among scholars, right? Who has the money to have access to these resources, who doesn't? And then it's really hard to keep policy updated in this rapidly changing environment. And also one of my kind of intellectual interests is just this culture of speed around the technology, right? And what that sort of perpetuates in terms of our how we think about teaching and our work. Also, there are just tons of right now variations in policies, right, among instructors, departments, colleges, right? Sometimes there's no policy, so that can be confusing for students. It can be confusing for us to know kind of what the common ground is. And in larger institutions, or maybe applies to your own campus, some of the decisions might be top down, and you might have contingent faculty having to implement these policies they didn't create. And some of those, it can be labor intensive work, right? If it's not informed by sort of faculty expertise, or just might be labor intensive in general, right? Academic administrators might try to increase class sizes and modify workloads as a result of this if they think, right, that some of these technologies can remove some of the labor of responding to writing or producing it. And it just undermines a wide range of research practices, right, in research, in peer review, in writing, that characterize scholarship. So this diversity, or the difference in voice, for example, we talked about this a little bit, gets flattened, right? And there's research in Germany saying, it could be that academic writing might become more homogenous, and English might sort of even become more prominent as a language of research as these models develop and get more powerful. So that's a lot. I know that that's like a big list, right? And it gives me a headache, and it makes me want to just like take a nap when I think about all of those challenges. But some of the rewards are, there were benefits for writing instruction, at least what the field, like scholars in the field who've come together, drafted this really great white paper on writing with AI, fields of literary and writing studies. They've said, hey, this can be a really great tool for stimulating thought, developing drafts. It can help students overcome writer's block who have facing a blank page and do some brainstorming, give them a way into an assignment, so to speak. It can really be great for thinking about our assignments more broadly, like thinking about writing as multimodal, not only text, but also image or sound, right? Since there's a variety of AI tools that can create still images or sound or moving images, it might be really interesting. I think one scholar had students write children's books with the help of AI and generate images that were particular to the text. I mean, there can be some kind of interesting intellectual work that one can do beyond reproducing text or producing text. And it can also provide lots of models of prose that can be used to highlight the differences in different kinds of text, in genre, in tone, in diction, in style, or disciplinary focus. We did a little bit of that. We gave it different prompts to get it to approach something from a different discipline, but it can help us see differences in real time, like in our classrooms. It might be another tool. And it can be complement existing tools for English language learners, right? It can be an addition, or students also that have learning differences, right? It can be a more powerful addition to Grammarly too, and give our students access to the language of power if they choose, right? We understand that that's like problematic, and there's a whole research in sociolinguistics that students write to their own languages and so on. We could have a whole debate about that. But if students make a choice that they want something to have a surface level correctness in a particular context, they have access to that language of power if they choose to access it, right? And so those might be potential benefits for some writers. I know this is a long list. We're gonna become more interactive soon, I promise. But one thing to think about, okay, it's a long list, and you might be thinking, okay, how much of this really applies to me or to my own course? There's research that's coming out now that students are already using ChatGPT, and maybe you've talked with students on your campus, you've had this experience. They're using it in different ways, and the initial studies are saying some students are using it to write full essays. A lot of students are using it to brainstorm ideas or to polish prose, right? To the surface level correctness that they're aspiring to catch so-called errors, right, in their writing, to polish, to generate a thesis statement or to refine a thesis statement, or to kind of refine the results of their writing by feeding ChatGPT prompts.
Hang in there, everybody. We'll get back soon, hopefully. Thanks for your patience, everyone. There's the benefit of her being able to join us from Germany, but then the risk that's a long ways for internet to internet. Please do chat amongst yourselves. Maybe you can talk about other risks and benefits you've seen, or everyone loves to talk about ways they've seen students use ChatGPT for better or for worse.
I have a question for everyone, and that is, I mean, I use, I do a lot of analysis of film and of images, and as far as I can tell, like that makes it, I mean, students couldn't just plug in an image and ask ChatGPT to analyze that for them. Is that, I mean, just a question, throwing it out there.
Good question. I haven't seen any AI-based things where you can put in an image and get a text. It's like all image or all text. You can put in text and get an image.
If it's a really well-known image, then the descriptions of it might be in the corpus of data that the large language model is trained on.
Yeah, so you could say, like, how would bell hooks respond to the Mona Lisa? And it would give you something.
I have seen automatic like alt text generators. So you can put in an image and it'll generate automatically alternative text for like accessibility reasons. And I think you can like Word will do that, like Microsoft Word. So it probably wouldn't give like, I don't think Microsoft Word would give you like a detailed analysis, but there might be some sort of similar technology out there.
You could use Amazon Turk and have pay people to analyze images for you.
I see Elizabeth put a question in the chat about getting it to show references. Does everyone want to maybe experiment with ChatGPT and see if it will generate references? I think maybe you can ask it, can you generate references for these these lists of writing and see what comes up.
I just want to share with you all on references that I tried Claude from Anthropic because I thought I had read that it was being trained to not hallucinate or, stick to the facts. And I asked for it to give me references on the possibility of unemployment, the economic effects of generative AI. It gave me 5 links, each of which it had totally made up. Were completely fictional. So right now I asked it for some references on post-work theories, and it's, and it's giving me some nice references on post-work theories that are real. But just, I was disappointed in Claude.
Yeah, I've heard that in the previous workshops that I've attended about ChatGPT, that has been one of the concerns, that the platform can make up references. I shared in the chat the response that it gave me when I asked it for references, and it was like, yeah, no, sorry. I put all this together based on a lot of different databases and response, but Cheryl said that she got the same response, but also some suggested sources. Cheryl, do you want to expand on that? Which sources did it give you?
I'd had asked a different question, but it just gave me a couple of books, a couple of academic journal articles, which I know a couple of them, and then some websites. But they're very general sources.
How did you ask the question?
Oh, because I was just chatting about something else. So I asked, can you generate references for this response? And I had asked about some gender and leadership questions, and I told it to tell me more about what, one of the bullet points, tell me more about this. And then I asked for references, and it just gave me very generalized references or generalized sources. It says, I cannot, what does it say? It said the same thing it said for you. I'm unable to generate specific references. So.
Andrea, you're back.
Yeah, sorry about that.
One of the joys of distance.
Yeah, I just realized, I think it's like 7:30 at night, so I think everybody's using Netflix or something in Germany now. And so learning also, this is maybe a bad time to do a workshop, but yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, but I'm glad you were able to continue talking. Okay, so let's see, we have 20 minutes left. We could, let's see, I'm going to give us some options. Maybe we'll vote. So we could just start talking. We could skip to the end and kind of think about, I could give you a couple of frameworks from the field about maybe how to talk to students about AI in your syllabi, but in your discussions, or we could talk about, what does the field say about meaningful writing assignments? Like how do we teach writing? How do students learn how to write? And then some thoughts about how AI might supplement that. I'm just cognizant that I'm running a bit behind given the interruption here. Would folks like to dive into a more open-ended conversation? Is that where people are feeling where the energy is? Yes. Okay, good. So yeah, maybe yeah, maybe we can yeah, just dive in. So so you've got a laundry list of different sort of risks of different opportunities for students. I'm curious if if any of you have, I guess what are maybe things that come to mind, things that you would like to try or test, or questions that you have that we can think about, brainstorm together about in this space. So things that came up for you, questions or ideas, or comments.
Well, my question, I mentioned this in the chat. What I'm wondering, I'm teaching ID1 at Pomona, which is the version of the first year seminar that you were talking about, Andrea. And what I'm thinking about the two things that you just mentioned. One, what kind of language should I include in the syllabus? I always have two versions of the syllabus. So they have the first version, but I always revise it with sources that they suggest and other things, ground rules that they suggest and all that. So I'm planning to include language about ChatGPT in that second version, because honestly, I didn't know what to say. And the first, I haven't decided what my policy is going to be. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is I'm trying to find or to come up with assignments or things that we can do in the classroom to use ChatGPT to help them learn how to write. So I know that there's a colleague here at Pomona, and I didn't hear from him. I heard it from someone at this workshop that is already using it in that way. So he gives, he has students generating text using prompts in ChatGPT and then criticize the results in class. I have to talk to him about it. I haven't had time, but I would like to hear like what other people are thinking or what other people have been doing already.
Okay. Yeah, so two questions. One is about how to communicate policy, and the other is about what are some strategies that you're using. Has anybody tried things out and had some success, or maybe not some success, that they could share to gather some collective wisdom here? Dustin?
Yeah, I've heard quite a few people suggest the idea to have GPT generate some response and then the student, respond to that response or critique that response. The problem is that GPT can do the critiquing as well. So, and another variant of this idea is, so I'm in philosophy, and philosophy professor suggested that they were going to have their students have a sort of Socratic dialogue like with GPT, and then just, record the results and submit that. Just sort of like go back and forth with GPT on the nature of justice. But the problem is you can just ask GPT to create the dialogue like between GPT and a fictional user. And it, it just does a fantastic job. So yeah, I'm not super optimistic about that approach, but.
Yeah, part of what you're bringing up too is what this technology makes us aware of, is having to say, if ChatGPT can do it, why am I signing it? Right? So really so in a way, it's really asking us to think fundamentally about why we're asking students to do the things that they're doing, and to come up with an answer that's compelling to us first, right? So that it's also compelling to students, right? Have others I've seen some nods in the room. Is this resonating with some of the questions or approaches that others are asking of themselves or using?
If I could quickly respond to Dustin's, because it's true that ChatGPT can do both, but that makes me think that sometimes I assign assignments not because I actually want to read like research proposals from intro psych students on psychology, but because ChatGPT can write those and I can write those, but because I want them to practice doing it. But is that reason compelling enough to students to be like, I need you to like write a sort of bad version that could be done better by me or by a machine, because I want you to be able to do it yourself to get to the next level. Like I want you to, part of it is that the knowledge lives in you. It doesn't live in the computer, because you need to build this foundation so you can do it later.
Esther?
Yeah, related to what Sarah just said, my first reactions to GPT, to ChatGPT, but obviously before I tried it, because I just tried it now, was that the kinds of questions and the kinds of papers that I assign to my students are usually very personal, right? So even when I have, and I haven't had it in a while, but even when I have exams, I give take-home exams, and the questions are very much about having my students using the readings and the concepts to understand their own experiences. So that's why at the beginning I wasn't very worried about ChatGPT, because I was like, well, this is not something that any platform can generate for them. This is something that, you know, they relate to their own family, their own community, their own gender, their own, you know, racial group, whatever it is that they want to talk about. And oh, I just lost my train of thought. I was going to say something else. Anyway, if it comes back, I'll share it.
Yeah, that it's really personal, you were saying too, right? So how do you integrate a tool for something that's also so personal? Like where might it be useful, or is it useful? Dustin?
Oh, I thought Esther, was your suggestion that, you know, that maybe GPT can't do the kind of assignment that you're asking your students to do because you're asking them to write from a personal perspective, and GPT doesn't have such a perspective? Is that the thought?
That's part of it, but you just reminded me of the second part that I was going to say. In one of the workshops that we had at Pomona, one of our staff members who works a lot with students, Travis Brown, was saying that he has already engaged students in this conversation. And what the students told him was, look, we're already using it. And Andrea already referred to this, but they also said, we use it in classes that, and I don't remember if this was the exact wording that he used, but basically they said, we use it in classes that we don't care that much about. When the class is really a class that I'm really invested in, then I do my own writing. So I think that's also connected to you know, to this, and maybe I'm just being naive. Maybe my students are already doing it, and I haven't realized it. I don't think so, based on the writing style, you know, and also because I see the evolution in the writing throughout the semester. But maybe they are. But my main conclusion getting out of that workshop was, okay, so I need to make sure that it's worth for them, you know, like it's worth for them to really reflect on their own experiences, learn how to use this concept so that they can use them in their everyday life and so on. But also the very beginning of this workshop, I think, and you've referred to this a couple of minutes ago, Andrea, I think it's also about us reminding ourselves why it's important for us to have our students learn how to write. And maybe part of what I need to do is make that more explicit, you know, put it in the syllabus and have that conversation with them, and like have a session where I emphasize that more. This is not just because it's another kind of assignment, you know, it has all these functions. And ironically, ChatGPT was very good at summarizing what those functions and those roles are. But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to use it. I'm just trying to figure out ways to use it in which it helps students make their writing better, not feel incentivized not to write, if I'm making myself clear.
Yeah, great. Barbara?
I just wanted to build on what Esther said and what Stephanie wrote in the chat. So I put in my first writing assignments due on Wednesday for org theory. I'm going to lower my hand, sorry. And the prompt is is long, like it's a whole page, but basically the question is, who am I as an empowered and empowering organizational actor? Where do my values come, organizational values come, and how do I embody them? So I put it in the chat GPT, and I put in various student like life experiences, like as a first generation American from an immigrant, low income immigrant household, how would I respond to this prompt? And then I put like, you know, as someone who experienced blah, 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 on this prompt. And it's interesting because like it comes up with like, you know, as a first generation college student hailing from an immigrant household, I've always strived to navigate a complex path towards self-discovery and empowerment. Like it has this thing and it has this list of 12 things. So if I stop there, like I would respond to students like, this isn't, that there's something about like, it is particular to, it's possibly particular to a you know, specific to a particular experience, but it's also very generic. And like, as a reader, that's not really satisfying to me because I'm seeking connection. And so when I read that, I'm like, okay, but what about you particularly? Can you tell a story? Can you know, somehow tie it back to our readings? Is there something that in our class that spurred your thinking that you can have like as you're centering text that you're revolving your response around? And then the second thing is like maybe hear peer review. You know, students reading each other's work can help. Like, does this connect? Like, if I'm a, you know, first year student and I'm reading this, like, what do I think about this? Like, okay, here's my list of, you know, 12 features that I have. Like, is that, because then like I was thinking if I want students to do it, I could say, well, I did tell them like in real life, you will want to talk about yourself as an organizational actor. What is when you have an interview or when you're meeting someone or you're talking to, I don't know, your parents or someone says, what's org studies? You can talk about yourself and the field and help them understand it. So like these kinds of responses that came out of ChatGPT do that. Like I could see a response like this in a cover letter, but like in a conversation, I can't really see it as helpful. So I feel like there's a conversational element that encourages students, yeah, like I want to embrace my unique experience. I really want to be here. I really want to share who I am. And I want to connect with you, maybe because your experience is the same, maybe because your experience is different. And so like maybe it's that conversational element that then comes into, like, this would be a great place to start. Like if I were 18 years old and someone asked me who am I as an organizational actor, I'd be like, I don't know. But maybe I would look at ChatGPT and be like, oh, well, here's some possible things. I'm going to choose one of them and then tell my story. I would feel like that would be okay versus like copying, pasting this thing and being like, okay, here's my paper.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Like the sense of connection too, right? That we're writing to connect with other people. And we also, what you were saying also made me think about my comment in New Light too. We need to believe what we're saying, right? We need to believe our arguments. That ChatGPT can make an argument for you, but it can't make your argument, right? Those are two really different things. Dustin, did you want to say something? I think your hand was up just a moment ago.
Well, yeah, I was just, I mean, I guess, I mean, so, you know, I'm very concerned with how do we make sure that students are going through these cognitive exercises on their own and aren't just submitting something, you know, written by GPT. And so with that question in mind, this question of like, can it write very personal things? Like it can. you just ask it to make them up, you know. You just say, you know, write an essay from the perspective of so and so, and make sure it includes very specific examples from that person's life, you know, maybe about that time that, you know, their grandmother was dying and they had that conversation about such as, you know, and then it will just make up something that sounds very, very personal. And from your perspective as the teacher, you know, you typically won't know whether it's true or whether it's just all, you know, BS.
Corey?
Yeah, I think there's two ways around this right now, because ChatGPT or other large language models are very powerful. You either have to convince students that it's worthwhile to take your assignment seriously by teaching them that fact, or write your assignment in such a way that it really revolves around a core text, and that core text needs to be obscure enough that it's not in the corpus of data that the large language model was trained on. And it needs to also be long enough that you can't just upload it to ChatGPT 4 or Anthropic's Claude and have it analyze that text and be using that text as a reference model. So it needs to be like a very long article or book level, short book level, level of detail. But I think you really need to go along with that first point of convincing your students that writing is important, taking your assignments seriously is important, and that they're paying for this college education and not the degree itself.
Yeah, I just want to reemphasize that. I think, again, based on that panel workshop that I attended here in Pomona, that was my main takeaway. I mean, Dustin, I know that the platform can do it. That was part of what that was part of the examples that people shared. The logic I'm following, and at least what I took away from that workshop is different. It's less about the platform itself and its possibilities, and it's more about what our students decide to do, right? So what I heard in that, and what I shared with you earlier that Travis Brown was saying, is if the students care enough about the class and decide, okay, so this is a class that is asking me, for instance, it's easier for me because I'm in the humanities and social sciences, and might be more difficult in STEM or in other areas. But if the student feels a personal connection, it feels that the class is really asking them to reflect on their own experiences, or is asking them to learn in a way that they feel engaged, then their decision is going to be different. That's what I was trying to convey. But again, in any event, I do want to learn about, ways in which we can use it, because it's out there anyway. And I said earlier, for instance, I use Grammarly all the time. English is not my first language, so Grammarly actually helps me save a lot of time. I use Google Translate all the time, even for my social media posts. So I know it's not the same thing, but it's the same logic in the sense that those platforms are doing things that we were supposed to do ourselves, even like 5 or 10 years ago. So I'm not against the platform, but I do want, and I think Stephanie put it much better than me earlier in the chat, to find ways in which we can explain to our students, what are the ethical ways in which we want them to use it.
Great. So maybe Elizabeth is the last comment. Then I'll just have a few concluding remarks.
So I was thinking about the information from GPT, maybe a little bit separate from writing. And once I was thinking, when we started today, you asked us, why do we have our students write? And I felt like we had a kind of a nice conversation in the chat. We were all reflecting on that. And sort of as a group, we came together with this list. And I was kind of feeling like, oh, this is why I'm at a liberal arts college, because we all think this and we're doing this great work. And then I typed it into ChatGPT and almost the same list came up. And it was kind of like a little sad, like, oh, like they already knew that. But there was something very satisfying, I felt like, generating it ourselves. So I kind of feel like with teaching, somehow we can get students to realize, yes, you could type it in and ChatGPT will put this nice list together. But if you've thought and reflected on it and then come up with a list, how like it belongs to you in a way that it doesn't with ChatGPT. And then the other piece I was thinking is when we were typing things in and information was coming up, you all were commenting on, well, this was pretty good and it got this a little bit wrong and this. And I was like, that's what we're trying to teach our students to be able to do, right? To have that conversation instead of taking it like an oracle. Well, GPT says this, So I feel like if we can we don't want to get to a point, where they're just information just going in. So I feel like even just saying, wouldn't you like to be able to tell someone, your friend or whatever, well, this what ChatGPT got this right, but this isn't quite right, and they're missing this, and so maybe that's kind of a motivation. It's just to kind of like really stepping back, like what's the point?
Right. That's so powerful too, because I think it also just why are we here? Why are we in a liberal arts college, right? So that we don't have to be in Zoom, right? Meetings, like for teaching, right? There's something about the embodied experience of the classroom or ideas where there's a freshness and a vitality there that's like powerful. And we also want to like teach our students to speak back to like these figures of authority, and ChatGPT has this kind of like you're saying, like this oracle like quality that's sort of unreflective also in popular discourse about what it can do, and we can be kind of really locked down in our thinking about it. I want to leave you with like a few things, because a lot of what you've said like resonates with some sort of like best practices. I mean, I hate that word, but like some there's a lot of research around like what is a good writing assignment, because I think what you're saying is, hey, students are going to write if they feel like it's meaningful, and I need to really be clear on like why we're doing the things that we're doing and like why they matter, and also be sure like that it's resonating, that I'm being responsive as a teacher, that I'm giving students like assignments or creating like an intellectual environment that they want to participate in like together and build community with each other like together in, right? And there's a lot of research that says, we thought that learning how to write was just practice. It was like riding a bike, just like eventually learn how to do it, and then you can just do it over and over again in different terrain. But it's really not like that. It's like an embedded social practice, and more is like less can be more. It's not about the volume that students produce. It's not about getting them to write a whole lot. It's also about getting them to be flexible in their thinking as writers and to make informed choices and have debate around why something is not quite right, right? The vibe feels off. Like, okay, you say the vibe feels off. Like, what does that mean? Let's unpack that, right? Like, let's really talk about style, like philosophically, like in this class, right? So one is that writing processes need to be interactive, right? So Stephanie mentioned peer review, and Claudia was saying, I found that helpful too, right? Are we building an opportunity for students to talk to each other about their writing, to really think critically with each other about their writing? That is something that they learn from a lot. It builds community, and they learn a lot from each other's strengths, because sometimes our strengths are also our weaknesses. I know that I'm like very informed by the German context. Like it's very like encyclopedic, the way that I write. It's Baroque. Like I am a maximalist. My co-authors are all minimalists. Like we keep each other like in line, but also like meaning making tasks. Are assignments relevant to our students, right? Are they reading things that feel relevant, that feel intellectually exciting, right? Are we asking them to do more than just summarize, right? Are we respecting them as intellectuals, giving them writing tasks that feel authentic? Are we making them feel real? Like for my class, I had students write manifestos, but I also made sure that they were recorded, and then they became a part of an art gallery exhibit for their peers, right? So that's maybe like a high effort kind of assignment, but thinking about, is this assignment feel real and authentic, like something somebody would want to do? Does it have a real audience? Does it have real consequence in the world? Like, can we think about how to make our assignments feel more that way for students, so that they actually want to do them, right, and are invested? And then, are we being really clear in our expectations? Those of you who want ideas, the German research right now is all about, okay, here's all the stages of the writing process, and here are all the tools like that you can use. So I've put that in some of the slides, like in case you want to do that. But if you want to have debate, like students, okay, so I hear from the German case, students are using ChatGPT for assurance, right? Maybe like I use it with my German all the time, right? And I know that I can see the limitation, and my German's good enough, I can see the limitations of the translations that it produces and so on and so forth. But I have some prompts that I've given you where you could have students actually have ChatGPT give them feedback. But the best practice, like what scholars and writing studies are saying, is that we need to build in opportunities for reflection, choice, also seeing the limits of the tools. So if you have them use ChatGPT to give them feedback on a text, also do feedback first in real life with their peers, and then maybe you can have them reflect on what does each party see and what does each party miss? What are the limitations and the power of each? And those can be really, I think, powerful experiences for students, where they actually get to kind of test out the technologies, but also respond to them, right, with authority that they themselves can build. So I want to just stop things there, but since we're actually several minutes over time, but I want to thank you for your patience and for your participation. This is really like a work in progress for me. Like I feel like it's like a mountain of stuff. and something that I'm definitely learning about, and I appreciated our conversation. It's very energizing for the work that you're doing with your students, and also the iconoclasm in the room around ChatGPT. I think is a great ethos to leave with. So I have left in my slide on the last slide how to get in contact with me if you have questions. I'm a total writing nerd. Like, people think they're bugging me, but this is actually like what I'm passionate about and what I do. What I'm more articulate about when it's not 8 p.m. at night in Berlin. But yeah, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you on campus next year.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us late at night.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea, and thank you, everybody. And have fun in Germany, Andrea.
Thank you. Berlin is very fun.
It is. I've been. I love that city. I love that city. Bye, everyone.
Well.